There's two important strands to Gamergate, but they're largely inseparable. These are the concerns over moral panic and censorship, and, the central strut of the whole thing, the desire for ethical games journalism. Subcultures and youth cultures have a long history of being maligned and misrepresented, often by the media, and, looking back, these complaints always seem charming, ridiculous, and scary by degrees. In the 50s we had panics over Elvis's hips on the Ed Sullivan Show, and Frederick Wortham crusaded against comics, which led to the debilitating Comics Code, which in turn held back comics as a mature medium for decades. In the 60s and 70s there were concerns over pornography and subversive magazines and comics and drugs, of which the Oz trial is perhaps the most famous and concerning. Coming into the 1980s we hit one of the most terrible failings of news media, and one of the biggest assaults on subcultural identity was the Satanic Panic, where the bizarre claims of Michelle Smith were reported on relatively uncritically by the media, not least because her husband was a psychiatrist, and this lent it some credibility, and this whole thing ended up kicking off a decade of moral panic over role-playing games, heavy metal music, neo-paganism, and more, including book burnings, and feeding into the PMRC, and feeding into the later vampire panic of the 90s. Even Pokemon have been called satanic. The corpse of this moral panic is still twitching and still causing problems to this day. In the 90s we had Jack Thompson, who you should be aware of. He is a disbarred lawyer who at the time was trying to bring about censorship and classification of games media on a much more draconian basis than had already been enacted. Thompson was only really taken seriously by the conservative media at the time, but the same games cause violence idea still turns up from time to time, as now do related but equally untrue claims that games cause sexism, racism and so on, all without any scientific basis. So how is this relevant to media ethics, and how is it relevant to Gamergate? Well, in many of these cases the media made the problem worse, with sensationalist and inaccurate reporting, repeating claims without examination as though they were true. In the latter stages of these panics, the media seemed to come around finally, or at least start reporting both sides reasonably evenly. Eventually, it was scientific and media investigation that disarmed Thompson and disarmed the Satanic Panic. That hasn't happened in regard to Gamergate and computer games yet. The point is, nerds have a siege mentality, and they are very used to being shat on by the media failing to do its job. They deserve better. That's the broader context. Let's focus in a bit more on gaming history specifically. We already talked about Jack Thompson, but he's old news at this point, and more importantly, the gaming media actually defended the hobby against his accusations. That's not true of the accusations that come from Anita Sarkeesian and her ilk, despite being just as spurious and just as poorly supported. Accusations of sexism, racism, lack of representation, and other alleged failings in games media have been uncritically reported on and spread as though they were true, in much the same way that Michelle Smith's satanic ramblings were. Also, similarly, they drew authority from a game studies academia that's not really worthy of the name, much as Frederick Wortham, having the title Doctor, made his ramblings about comics seem more authoritative and believable. Let's be clear though, games media has always been corrupt. That's been the status quo since the dawn of the medium. Financial corruption and PR as news goes back at least as far as Nintendo Power magazine, and there's any number of issues with paying for reviews, threats made against reviewers and magazines or websites to remove early access privileges, and so on. This was normal, this was the status quo, this was what everyone was used to. The games sites reporters being bribed and threatened was just how things were done. It's all very well recorded, and it's all been quite vociferously protested before. So why did Gamergate blow up, and why has most of its ire been blasted against independent developers and activist reviewers? Well, the financial corruption everyone knew about and could work around with some cynicism and skepticism. The indie scene, however, set itself up as being more moral, more progressive, more experimental, and just damn it better than the existing status quo. The activist reviewers made out this new state of affairs to be a great leap forward, but also started looking down their nose at regular games and regular gamers. Looking for things to make a fuss about. Clickbait. And then these people who'd set themselves up as being better than everybody else turned out to not be disclosing conflicts of interest. They turned out to be paying each other off, giving each other's companies business, favouring their friends and lovers, and, to cut a long story short, being just as corrupt as any of the people they were previously criticising. With the added problem of participating in the new moral panics targeting games. This was the last straw, and it came to a head with the Quinspiracy, wherein the failure to disclose conflict of interest over promotional articles for a lover segued into what we now call Gamergate, as revelation after revelation about corruption and nepotism began to emerge. To summarise, Gamergate emerged from a very long history of nerd and niche groups being misrepresented by media and the establishment, and a shorter history of holier-than-thou participants in the new moral panic attacking them. On the 27th of August 2014, the actor Adam Baldwin made what's considered to be the first proper use of the Gamergate hashtag, referencing internet aristocrats' videos, which themselves formed a transition from the older Quinspiracy issue to the new Gamergate issue, which took the concerns over the lack of journalistic ethics that had emerged from the earlier scandal and ran with it. Because Baldwin is a right-wing figure, and because Internet Aristocrat was also involved in the Quinspiracy, people have mistakenly written off Gamergate as misogynistic or right-wing as a movement. As surveys have since shown, Gamergate is very broadly a left-libertarian movement with progressive values, but progressive values more akin to classical liberalism. That hasn't stopped people reporting otherwise, though. Gamergate, knowing they'd get a rough deal from the conventional media, set about adopting activist tactics for themselves, creating and sustaining the hashtag and beginning a campaign of emailing sponsors of websites. Given that the websites themselves, mostly initially, refused to even consider that they might have ethical issues, many have since tightened or expanded their policies thanks to Gamergate, this was the only path left to protest, especially considering that censorship was rampant on almost every website you can think of. This tactic of going after sponsors, in large numbers, cost Gawker alone multiple millions of dollars, something that's still relatively unreported on. Perhaps the key galvanizing event of Gamergate that really made it take off was the near-simultaneous release of markedly similar articles attacking the gaming audience and hobby across a great many websites, the so-called Gamers Are Dead articles. This was suspicious, and ultimately helped to expose the Game Journo Pro's email list, which was being used to coordinate by ideologically aligned games journalists in a manner similar to the way in which the Journo list scandal in mainstream media emerged. Very large numbers of gamers were now both very, very angry and very, very aware that something was rotten in the state of Denmark. The mainstream media now began to pick up on the controversy, but rather than do any research whatsoever or talk to anyone from the Gamergate side, all of whom have been very open about wanting to talk about it, they uncritically parroted the defences that the corrupt journalists under fire had made, along with spurious accusations of misogyny, etc., that were being used to deflect. Lazy mainstream media mindlessly repeating what they're told by one side has been a repeated and dangerous issue throughout Gamergate, and has created a rift between a predominantly left-libertarian Gamergate and the left-leaning parts of the media. It has exposed yet again that even tech reporters in the mainstream media do not understand the internet or gaming culture or internet culture, and that they make zero effort to do so. The emergence of Not Your Shield is another very significant event in Gamergate, and one which again has been misreported, this time as a supposed prank or a creation of sock puppets, fake accounts, to try and counter attacks on Gamergate, that it was somehow exclusively white, male, heterosexual and, neologism alert, cisgender. Not Your Shield represents a good chunk of angry people from various minorities sick of being used as a shield by pseudo-progressive activists and journalists coming under fire. This significant number of minority people who agree with Gamergate on ethical and censorship issues and believe that alleged isms and misrepresentation issues aren't as big a deal as being reported on, and these people have been criminally underreported on. It's also necessary here to talk about Wikipedia. The Wikipedia article on Gamergate is utter trash. It is not fair, balanced, measured, or otherwise fair or accurate in any way whatsoever. The edit wars over it have exposed a great deal of activist and paid-for editing on Wikipedia, and have destroyed confidence in it amongst Gamergate in much the same way that their confidence in the left-wing media has been utterly destroyed by misreporting on Gamergate. Sadly, Wikipedia is often a first, and often only, source for journalists reporting on a lot of things. The Fine Young Capitalists, a charitable effort to help women in gaming, previously trashed by the darlings of anti-Gamergate, was fully funded, largely by Gamergate, who have since gone on to fund a great many charitable efforts and to help a great many people, particularly including women and minorities, which is strange behaviour for people who supposedly want women and minorities out of gaming. Again, this has barely been reported on. While anti-Gamergate monopolised the media with claims of threats, many disproven, unrelated, or considered non-credible by law enforcement, threats and many other nasty tactics were used against Gamergate supporters, and these went completely unreported. People received death threats, images of printouts of their faces covered in semen, razor blades and syringes in the post, dead animals. Gamergate supporters had people call their places of work in attempts to get them fired, sometimes successfully, on the basis of spurious accusations, again of misogyny, racism, etc. All of this culminated in a bomb threat against a Gamergate meetup in Washington, the threat against which was considered legitimate, but which got less coverage than similar threats, considered illegitimate, against anti-Gamergate speakers. The emergence of an abuse of block bots is also worth mentioning. Perhaps the most notorious now is that one created by Randy Harper. A block bot preemptively removes people from your Twitter feed so that you can't see anything that they say. The idea is supposed to be used to form groups to block trolls and spammers and abusers, but the concept has been itself abused to preemptively block people who merely have different viewpoints. This blockbot, the Good Game Auto Blocker, however, blocks Gamergate, and anyone even loosely associated with Gamergate, and anyone who follows anyone from Gamergate, and it's been promoted, libelously, as an anti-harassment tool, despite actually just being an ideological bubble. In terms of media impact, use of the Good Game Auto Blocker has cut off huge amounts of alleged journalists from primary sources on Gamergate, and has helped them maintain an echo chamber where they only hear people who agree with them. All of this false information, false reporting, culminated probably most hilariously in a Law and Order Special Victims Unit episode inspired by Gamergate, which is pretty much this generation's version of Mazes and Monsters. Tom Hanks was in it. Look it up. These are just some of the highlights of Gamergate's history. There's a hell of a lot more, and all of it helps create context and understanding and further exposes just how terrible and one-sided the reporting on Gamergate has been, how much the media has failed, how far from the truth it is, how the most basic tenets of ethical conduct in journalism, presenting both sides, checking what's actually true, talking to actual proper sources, these things have not been adhered to. Despite all this, however, there is hope. Gamergate has largely won in terms of ethics and games journalism, but in the process it has revealed broader problems of lazy research, clickbait, sensationalism, moral panic, and cluelessness stemming from the mainstream media, especially in terms of handling internet culture or gaming issues. You can see the same mistakes happening now with the reporting on what's been going on at Reddit. The misreporting, the lack of understanding of the culture, the attempt to overwrite legitimate complaints against what's been going on there as sexism against power, as though incompetence and poor actions, as if ignorance is somehow the purview of a single gender, and that women are incapable of having any of these failings. Somehow, a group of gamers fed up with corruption and political proselytizing, sick of yet another moral panic, have been smeared and misrepresented. They have been abused, misunderstood, and treated as misogynistic, racist harassers, and all on the basis of lies from the people who are genuinely at fault. Gamers want an ethical games media, an uncensored games medium, and they do not want to be preached at. The media can do better, gamers deserve better. It's time to break out of this historical cycle of hysterical reporting. So what does Gamergate want at the end of a year of sacrifice and fighting and effort? Gamergate wants to be taken seriously. It wants its accusations to be taken seriously and looked at. It wants a better games media. It wants a free games medium. It wants what we all should want, which is the truth to be reported on, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. However anyone feels about it, we want to know what is true, and we want to put what we believe is true out there so it can be examined. And that's what we want from you.